Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all.
Not for decades has Saudi Arabia been caught in such a bright international spotlight, and our speaker today must at least bear some of the responsibility for putting it there. As one of the foremost Arab commentators on contemporary affairs, and in her capacity as a writer here today, she needs no introduction to any of you. Her new book is The Cradle of Islam, the Hijaz and the Quest for an Arabian Identity, and its significance could hardly be more timely as we seek to understand the strains and the violence that have become apparent in Saudi Arabia itself. Dr Yamani will take questions after her speech. There are books for sale down here. There will also be books for sale upstairs as well, and we envisage the meeting will end at around 6:30. Dr Yamani.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Imagine that you are all sitting in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I want you all to imagine that in a public gathering like this one, you would be unable to stand up and say who you are. Who you are is a secret, and those who have authority over you have forbidden you ever to reveal this secret. In public, you are forced to live a lie, or at least present part of your true self. When you go home, you start releasing all those pent-up feelings and anxieties about who you are. You sing when it is forbidden to do so. You chant praises for the Prophet Muhammad when it is forbidden. You wear the clothes you are forbidden to wear, and say the name you are forbidden to say. You become almost obsessive about your identity, the suppressed identity that finds expression in even the most innocuous details of daily life. Let me help you to try to imagine this repressed life or existence. Imagine England stretching north past Hadrian's Wall right up to the northern highlands, and imagine the people of that region referred to as belonging to northern part of England and forbidden to speak of their Scottish identity or culture. And likewise for the western region instead of Wales. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine you are in that gathering in Saudi Arabia, and I break the taboo, proclaim the forbidden name, and reveal all those secret details of our lives as Hijazis. Well, I have waited for 20 years. 20 years of observing and documenting the Hijazi identity and its various expressions. But I thought it was taboo, or even shameful, to speak about it or to publish it. I was like most other Saudis, indoctrinated with the importance of our national identity. But today I feel that so many Hijazis can still be citizens of Saudi Arabia without all this repression. The Al Saud have given their name to the country, and they have driven the national project based on the ideology of Wahhabi Islam and their vision for everyone to become their subject. That vision depended on a repression which in the end has failed. The regions, tribes, sects of Saudi Arabia have preserved rich cultural diversity and the enormous resources of the Saudi state could not assimilate or tame. The Al Saud could dominate but not integrate. The future citizens of Saudi Arabia will demand a different status and political role than the subjects of the past. If you are granted full citizenship rights, then your local or special identity is recognized and respected. In Great Britain, we do not refer to Scotland or Wales as the northern region or the western regions. Instead, they have their assemblies, seats in parliament, and recognition of their distinctive cultures. So let us look at the Hijazi predicament. To do so, I will draw 4 themes from my book. The repression of Hijazis. This repression takes different forms: political, religious, geographic. The preservation and the celebration of Hijazi identity in the face of this repression. The politics of alienation and the failure of nation-state formation. Ritual as resistance, a political movement turned cultural. The relationship between the Hijazis and the rulers, the Al Saud, have changed in important ways. 3 phases are significant. Phase 1 begins with the conquest of the kingdom of the Hijaz, its capital Mecca, and its annexation to what is now Saudi Arabia. This brought the 1,000 years of the Hashemites, Ashraf, rule to an end. The Hashemites handed to the Al Saud the most sophisticated political and administrative systems in the Arabian Peninsula. From the 1930s to the 1950s, the deal was that Hijazis would participate in the national project. This would mean that on the one hand, political and economic participation, but on the other, renouncing their cultural distinctiveness. For example, wearing the Najdi Saudi dress rather than their own if they seek employment. That seemed to happen during the second phase, the 1950s until the 1970s, when oil revenues started to come in. King Faisal acknowledged the experience and expertise of the educated Hijazis and brought them in to the new state bureaucracy. That was the beginning of political integration. And that was the oil boom period. The third phase, which is really the focus of my book, begins in 1980s and is still continuing today. This period saw the reversal or collapse of this political integration during King Fahad's rule. King Fahad's policy concentrated on Saudification, the absolute power of the Saudi rulers, and especially the power of the king and his full brothers, known as the Suderi Seven. This meant filling all important positions in the state with close family members. By now, the family numbered in the thousands. The allies of the ruling family, the Wahhabi religious establishment, also became more powerful. The alienation of Hijazis increased due to political and religious exclusion. Although a number of Hijazis became wealthy, they have no control over the sources of the wealth. They have been merely allowed into a client relationship with the rulers. They may get money, but they don't get power. My book focuses on the third period, that marks the emergence of Hijazi cultural consciousness. This is in direct response to the state's growing policy of restricting access to the political center. Increasingly, the rulers surrounded themselves only with the people who agree with them. The themes of repression, identity, alienation, and resistance are all aspects of the changing relationships between the Hijazis and the Al Saud rulers. Hijazi identity is not static, nor is their status in society and politics fixed in stone. Let's look at the repression of Hijazis. Since 1932, unification under the Najdi ruling Al Saud family has involved imposing Najdi standards of economic, political, and religious behavior. The Hijaz, as an identifiable entity, has simply been removed from contemporary maps of Saudi Arabia and has become nothing more than the Western province. The fact is, the political climate in Saudi Arabia precludes any overt expression of regional differences. You won't find any decree explicitly prohibiting the term Hijaz, but its use is seen as departing from the official emphasis on the social and political unity of the country. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, it's 10 years ago, a Saudi journalist told me that every time he wrote the word Hijaz, the editors replaced it with the Western region. These days, in certain PR pamphlets issued by the Saudi rulers for Western consumption, you may find the occasional reference to the Western coastal Hijaz. Try counting the number of times you can find it in Arabic in Saudi publications. Inside the country, the de facto prohibition on regional names is enforced, with a range of punitive sanctions. For example, if you open a school and call it Madaris al-Hijaz, the schools of the Hijaz, that would run into problems with the bureaucracy. It will eventually be closed. Or if a man wears the Hijazi dress, which is the jubba and the umama, he would be seen at best as eccentric. But if he wants to seek employment, it will be a problem. Let us now look at the efforts to preserve and celebrate Hijazi identity. Preserve it from the threat of extinction. The Hijazis express their identity by establishing clear social or cultural boundaries to distinguish themselves. These boundaries include dialect, pronunciation, intonation, and usage of terms, religion. Hijazis are not Wahhabi but Sunni, and some practice Sufism, which has been consistently suppressed by the rulers. Take food. Because the Hijaz attracted people from all over the Muslim world, the cuisine was infinitely varied, and now it's not allowed officially the Hijazi name. So if there are cookbook printed in the country, it won't say a Hijazi recipe, it will be Saudi food. In matters of dress, the Saudi rulers have effectively liquidated all regional clothing. Women who never wore this severe black veil or the abaya covering the face had to adopt the compulsory Saudi uniform when they leave home. Now let's take marriage. The Najdis, especially those who call themselves pure-blooded, the Gabili, consider Hijazis inferior and are reluctant to intermarry. Hijazis often say, we are not going to give our daughters to Najdis because polygamy is rampant among the princes. Then there's the constant name calling. Hijazis are frequently referred to as Tarsh al-Bahar, flotsam of the sea, or Bagaya Hujjaj, remnants of pilgrims. And the Hijazis have their own names for the other. Let's move on now to manners. The only thing, say the Hijazis, that sets them apart from the ruling family. This is another battleground with the royal family. So there is a whole competition going on between the official state identity and the manners and the ceremonies of the Hijaz. Royal ceremonies highlight the uniqueness of Saudi identity, sanctified by the Wahhabi establishment. Contrast these endless, staged, managed, televised events, extolling desert virtues and chivalry, with camels and sword dancing. Contrast all that with the Hijazi rituals, first forced out of the public eye and into private homes. So what consolation do the Hijazis have? In the end, it comes down to a sense of innate superiority, belonging as they do to the cradle of Islam, Mecca, the capital of all Muslims, and Medina. Everything can change, but not this. So the politics of alienation are well entrenched. Hijazis have now discovered that assimilation in the Najdi ruling elite is virtually impossible. So what is their reaction to this? Some of those who are educated have decided to call for reforms for the sake of national unity and the fight against terrorism. They even took their demands directly to Crown Prince Abdullah. And what did they get for return for their pains? Arrests and jail. For those who repented and renounced their demands, a ban on leaving the country, and a forced commitment never to speak of reform again. Other reformers who did not repent are still in jail. They've been there since March. But the Saudi state feels that it is advancing the process of reforms and recognizing pluralism. They held what they call a national dialogue, supervised by Crown Prince Abdullah. In it, they grouped Hijazis, Shia, Salafi, Ismailis, and said to them, talk. And that was the extent of the national dialogue. The religious authorities haven't given it legitimacy, and it's made no difference whatsoever to the reality on the ground. But what Hijazis resist most are the attacks on their religious rituals and customs. The Wahhabis have labeled at least two of the rituals as bid'ah, dangerous innovation, and kufr, idolatry. One ceremony, the Mawlid, the celebration for the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, has attracted no fewer than 13 fatwas from the most senior Wahhabi clerics. But the Hijazis are not deterred. Holding the Mawlid has become almost an obsession. Meanwhile, the religious police, the Matawa'a, have been unleashed on the Hijazis with renewed vigor. These members of the so-called Committee for the Ordering of the Good and the Forbidding of the Evil regard Hijazi customs as seriously infected with impurity and heresy. They even follow them to the graveyards, interfering with the final words, talqeen, that Muslims speak into the dead person's ear. The most important thing really at the moment that people talk about is the demolishing and the continuation of demolishing of religious sites in Mecca and Medina that are important for Hijazis but for other Muslims. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of Arab diversity in the face of Arab repression. The Hijazi example is but one. Many of you know many others. Unless Arab regimes learn to recognize, value, and appreciate diversity, they will never unlock the cultural and intellectual resources that they have at their disposal. Recognizing diversity is the road to peace and the kind of stability that has for so long eluded them. There is some urgency here. Last year's Arab Human Development Report made it clear that unless the countries in the region change or reform, they risk missing the flight to the future. I would like to think that one or two of them will, however late in the day, wake up in time to catch the flight. Thank you.
I'd like to ask whether Hijazis as a group in Saudi Arabia would, if they have a chance to participate in power, would help in the war against extremism in the region, and have they had a chance to participate in power in the past? And were there any moments earlier in the recent history where they have shown any difference in their position compared to the current Wahhabi sort of Al-Saud regime?
Well, it's a fact that the Meccan and Medina religious culture before the unification of the country, even at times under the Ottomans and in the days of the Hashemites, there was a much more open religious culture. There were the halagat al-ilm, the circles of knowledge, where there were debates, different groups, the different Sunni schools, the Zaydis, everybody was represented. What has happened is that in this national unity and attempt is that the Wahhabi, where it is an interpretation of the Hanbali, became the al-madhhab, and that was the only interpretation. Certainly there was a defensive and even radical approach and interpretation to Islam. Whether in this aspect, the Hijazis are not allowed to participate, even their ulama, the religious scholars, in the higher echelons of the religious establishment, because they believe that their doctrine is different, their aqidah is different. But this is the background to the more open cosmopolitan culture that I describe here, which of course would be helpful in fighting extremism and the violence that we're seeing today. As for their role directly, they don't have very much role, because the royal family, it's a bit too late. They have allied themselves to this Wahhabi group, and they're choosing now a whole wave of a wave of new Wahhabis to be the intermediaries between them, the royal family, and the extremists, and especially the terrorists.
Khalid Hnoub, Al Jazeera Channel. Don't you think that the talk about cultural repression, which is in my view in Saudi Arabia, is benign compared to political repression, would help with the calls for dividing the kingdom or the separation of different regions in Saudi Arabia, and in this case would create even more fierce regime and increase the political repression of the regime in using the call for cultural regional cultural identities as if people are calling for dividing the country, and the regime would defend the country, the unity of the country, and you are sort of providing some sort of weapon for the regime to get even more fierce and produce more political repression.
I'm sorry, are you suggesting that Dr. Yamani is providing another weapon?
No. Indirectly, I mean the book could be used or misused as if there are calls for cultural separation and creating the Hijazi identity, and maybe later on in 20 years' time, the Hijazi state itself. This will help the regime to say, well, we want to defend the unity of the country against sort of different calls for separation under the guise of cultural identity or something like that.
Well, the book is just present people's sense of identity and their culture, and it could either be useful so that the rulers can know about these people that they probably know very little about, like so many other groups who are shunned and they're supposed to be inferior, but maybe this is another contribution to knowledge. And if you know people, then you can have dialogue if you're serious about reform.
Ryan Hanrahan, BBC. You said at the beginning that this was a failed repressive policy, a regional repression policy which has failed. You sound as though you're saying it's actually very successful if repression is your ambition. Could you expand a bit on the way in which it's failed? I mean, has it failed because people still see themselves as having a strong identity? Has it failed because they still would like independence? I mean, in what way is it a failure?
When I said that the policy of taming or assimilating the rich variety of sects and be they the Shia, if they ask them to become Wahhabi, they don't want to. It's going to be impossible. Or the Hijazis to change their culture. What I mean is that despite the oil wealth, despite the attempts at suppressing the variety and the diversity of the country, that policy has failed. They were able to dominate but not to integrate. And that's what I meant by the policy that has failed. But since they're practicing anyway their mulids, and I say obsessively, they're doing it anyway, so that the fatwas against it and all the other rituals, in fact, have been some invented or modified and brought from the past, like most other groups do.
In the present circumstances of Saudi Arabia, the political structure, forget it. There would be no reconciliation, there would be no accommodation of other than the Sudairis. No Hadramaut, no Ha'il, no Najd. But the hope that once the sons of King Abdulaziz disappear, then you may get full brothers or half-brothers of their descendant, which is enormous, who are ambitious and liberal, and it is the hope of those people who may unite Saudi Arabia, but not the present time. And I don't know whether you have any reflection on that.
Can Saudi Arabia wait that long? That's... well, I mean, if we want reform, we want the second generation, and there are indeed liberal princes, and very educated, outstanding princes, and they have in the family models. I mean, I was referring to King Faisal's strategy, and he is the vision that he had, and he was a modernizer in his outlook. I like very much that saying by King Faisal that I quoted, that I put on my last book. He said, in one generation, we went from riding camels to riding Cadillacs. I'm afraid that the next generation, the way we're spending, we're going to be riding camels again. So you need a very strong ruler there with authority to stop the expenses, and especially of those young princes and their privileges and princely salaries, and, you know, and also, I mean, you need, so if that happens, that will be very good.
From the Arabic Association. You made two basic points. One is the cultural repression, and the other that the Wahhabis or the Sudairi servants in the Najd do not want to share power. Assuming that the Crown Prince reads your book and appoints you as an advisor on power sharing, what are the mechanisms that you would really recommend and think that he would listen to in terms of power sharing? I mean, if you think about it, there were periods when ministers, very important ministers from the western region, from, as you call it, the Hijaz, they dominated the government, including your very distinguished father, who was the Minister of Oil in the most important period, and he was probably the most important minister in the government. Now, I know you broke it down in periods and histories and what have you, but seriously, are you focusing on the cultural discrimination, or you want more power for the Najdis, and what would your recommendations be to Crown Prince Abdullah? Thank you.
Well, despite the fact that it is impossible, not only because Crown Prince would never sit with a female and commoner, and, you know, but I will still answer your question. The advice really is more dialogue. I mean, we've been watching television, these very sort of heavily staged sessions between Crown Prince Abdullah throughout the summer. I don't know if anyone sees Saudi television. It's interesting. With the Crown Prince Abdullah talking in a language to these people they line up from the tribes, and to say that, you know, we have trust in you, you've been good people, the old system. And then these people say, thank you, one of the leaders of you've given us the water, the electricity, you know. Now, this has to change. There should be a different role, different communication. There has been some progress in the freedom of the press. There has been some progress. But it's always like one step forward and two steps back. And when people are emboldened and write petitions and go to see Crown Prince Abdullah, they end up in jail. And they're still in jail. Why? For daring to ask for constitutional monarchy. It was just articles. This is where the new, or even, I mean, Crown Prince Abdullah is respected in the country. Many know this. He tries. He does not have authority. There are different factions and conflicts and different views about reforms in the country, and we know that Prince Naif, the Minister of Interior, has a different approach to reforms. He doesn't want reforms, I think. And to Crown Prince Abdullah, it is, but the point about my father, which I thought he might come in at some point, is how can I escape that? Of course, he was a Hijazi, and it was during that period. I mean, when the Ashraf, the Hashemites, left the Hijaz, and they did hand to the Al Saud, not only the most sophisticated administrative system, but there were public libraries, there were secular schools, there were newspapers, there were... So for those men who were born, like in 1930, and they were educated, they were very useful, and King Faisal knew that, and there were several in the government, and they were in the lead.
So this culture you are describing a desert, do you think it's right? And you are calling for unity and understanding, or that?
If you go back to reading my book,
I will.
then when I say some Hijazis perceive the Najdis as inferior because their cuisine is not like our Hijazi cuisine, that is more refined and rich, and the Bedouin cuisine is not. When I say they perceive, they see. I am not sitting here as an academic, and I spent years working and documenting this, to say that Najdis are not as nice or more inferior, or that would defy the whole point. What will happen then if we're Hijazis and we think, I'm calling for respect. Respect for diversity, respect for the other's culture. Respect for him, he's a Shia and I am a Wahhabi and the other is a Christian, or I want to, this is my whole point. And I hope that I did not convey, as you read, that I think one culture is better than the other. The fact they're competing and they call each other names, that's what I heard. So I put it down. I hope they will do that less in the future.
I am Hussein Al-Zain with Webster University. Dr. Yamani, I wanted to ask you, in regard to the Hijazi during King Faisal's time, what role were they given during his rule, and how did they fare in the role they were given, and why did such a dramatic change occur afterwards, particularly in reference to King Fahd, and why did he do such a dramatic shift?
There are four questions there. Can you just ask one?
Well, it's a timeline question in chronological order. Thank you.
This change became the restrictive policy. I talked already about the change in economic circumstances. And after 83, there was a recession. And I talked about the larger competition and the thousands in the royal family themselves. And so the policy of restricting the access to the center by King Fahd. But then he had all these problems like the Gulf War, the empowerment at that time of the religious establishment, and the whole system has changed. I mean, during the days of King Faisal, Saudi Arabia had no competition. It was as the capital of the Muslim world. There was secular Nasrims. I mean, I don't want to go into this now because it is long and details, but it's in the book. Yes, but everything changed. Iran, the Iranian Revolution, King Fahd became then the custodian of the holy places, and they had a much more defensive policy regarding the. I mean, what I put this to, and the violence that we're seeing, is unfortunately to failure of state formation, because there are so many people who feel marginalized either politically or economically and culturally. The Hijazis are not economically marginalized. That's not their problem. But this is the failure of state formation. And perhaps, as I say at the end, I hope it's not too late, because you can always reform and include and respect the other.
Dr. Yamani, thank you very much indeed. That brings us to the end of the formal part, but I know that there are people there who still have questions. Dr. Yamani will be here. She'll also be signing copies of her book, and I gather there are some refreshments available, so please do stay around. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you.